I'm Giuliano Hazan, and I'd like to congratulate you on your 10th season of The Zest. Congratulazioni.
I'm Leah Colon, and this is The Zest. Citrus, seafood, Spanish flavor, and Southern charm. The Zest celebrates cuisine and community in the Sunshine State. October is Italian-American Heritage Month, and we're highlighting some Floridians who make the best Italian-inspired foods this side of the Atlantic. We couldn't think of a better person to kick things off than Giuliano Hazan. He's an award-winning cookbook author, culinary teacher, and son of Italian cooking royalty. Before we jump in, I want you to consider donating to The Zest if you can spare a few dollars. We're a public media podcast, which means we rely on listeners like you to cover the costs of producing this show. That's everything from recording equipment like microphones and headphones that I'm wearing right now, to my actual salary, to gas money for me to drive from my house in Riverview down to Sarasota to interview today's guest. Even $5 or $10 would really help us out if you can spare it. There's a link to donate in the show notes and on our website, thezestpodcast.com. And we'll even send you a fun Zest sticker to say thanks. Thank you so much in advance. Now, speaking of driving down to Sarasota, that was a real scenario. I got to hang out with Giuliano Hazan. And when I arrived at his house in Sarasota, the first thing he did was offer me a cappuccino and a plate of biscotti. I'd actually eaten breakfast on the drive down. I put some oatmeal in a mug, so I ate in my car. I wasn't even hungry when I got there. But when Giuliano Hazan offers you an Italian breakfast, you take it. Giuliano is the only child of the late Marcella Hazan. She's the Italian-born food writer and cooking teacher who's credited with popularizing Italian food in the United States. Marcella and her husband, Victor Hazan, raised Giuliano mostly in New York City. And when he moved to Florida's Gulf Coast as an adult, his parents later followed. Marcella died back in 2013, but Victor still lives on Longboat Key. So Marcella's legacy speaks for itself. She has her cookbooks that live on. There's a documentary film about her in the works and a Smithsonian museum project also in the works. And in the meantime, Giuliano has established himself as an Italian cooking authority in his own right. I mean, how long do you have for me to list his credentials? He's written a handful of cookbooks. He teaches Italian cooking classes on his YouTube channel, at his home in Sarasota, and at his cooking schools in Italy, where he leads culinary tours with his wife, Lael Hazan. He's the real deal. Forbes.com named Giuliano's culinary excursions among their 5 top cooking and foodie vacations in Italy for 2019. Wow. So I recently sat down with Giuliano at his kitchen table. Between bites of that biscotti and sips of the perfect cappuccino, we discussed how his mother Marcella got her big break in America, Giuliano's own career in Italian cooking, and advice for making better Italian food at home.
My name is Giuliano Hazan. I'm a cookbook author. I've written 5 cookbooks. I'm a cooking teacher. We have a cooking school in Italy. And I also teach here in Sarasota, Florida. We do small hands-on classes. We import some Italian products, like an olive oil, a red wine vinegar, a balsamic.
So really I should have asked, what don't you do? Okay, I have so many questions already, and I feel like we need to start at the very beginning. But you mentioned that you import some products. Yes. So if I were to splurge on a couple of products for my pantry, what would you recommend?
Well, the first thing would be a good olive oil. Especially if you're going to cook Italian food, it's kind of essential to have a good olive oil on hand. You know, people sometimes think that, oh, well, you know, I should keep the good olive oil just to dress my salad, but, you know, I don't want to waste it when I'm cooking. But that's a totally wrong approach. Use olive oil for the flavor that it gives a dish. So you're going to want to use something that's going to give good flavor, right? And if you do, let's say, a dish of sautéed spinach with a good premium olive oil, and you do it with, cheap, not extra virgin olive oil, the difference in flavor between the two will be startling.
Okay, I feel like this could be a whole other podcast, but what is good olive oil? No, this is great, because I've heard that the stuff at the store isn't even necessarily 100% olive oil. So where do we get the good olive oil?
So, first of all, you should only use extra virgin olive oil. For an olive oil to be called extra virgin, it has to be produced by purely mechanical means, meaning without the use of chemicals or heat, and it must be done at room temperature. That's what cold press actually means. And then when it's done, when it comes out, it needs to be below a certain level of acidity. By law, can't be over 0.8% in acidity. Most good extra virgin olive oils are actually less than 0.5% in acidity. That's the first thing, extra virgin. And then you said you don't even know sometimes what's in it. And that's exactly true, because, for example, if you buy a bottle of olive oil and it says produced in Italy, but it doesn't say where the olives come from, then you really have no idea what you're getting, because it could be made with, certainly olives, from other countries, probably rejects from those countries, and sometimes even not olives at all, but other things. So if you're buying an Italian olive oil, you want it to say made with Italian olives. If you're buying a Greek olive oil, it should say made with Greek olives. So it's very important that you know where the olives come from.
Okay, that was a great tip already. Normally I ask people, how did you get into this? How did you get into cooking? And I know that your story even starts before you. So can you tell me a little bit about where your family is from, the region of Italy, and what is distinctive about that cooking style versus any other cooking style?
So both my parents were born in a region called Emilia-Romagna. My mother was born in a little town called Cesenatico, which is on the coast, on the Adriatic coast, about 100 miles south of Venice, a fishing village and beach town. And my father was born 9 miles inland in a town called Cesena. And Emilia-Romagna is definitely known for its food. In Italy, everybody is like, my region is the best in everything. But I think most people would agree that Emilia-Romagna has really good food. Pasta and rich foods, seafood, just almost anything.
Sounds amazing. So what were they doing when they were first coming up, and then how did they make their way to the U.S.?
So, my father, when he was 9, moved with his parents to the U.S. My father's family was Jewish, and my grandfather was very shrewd, and he realized that it was not a good idea to stay in Italy. And so he sold all his businesses, and they moved to New York. After college, my father decided he really wanted to go back to Italy. He really missed it. He missed the food there and the culture. And so he went back to Italy. He got himself a little apartment outside of Florence. But in the summers, of course, he went to Cesenatico, because that's where you went in the summer. And he met my mother there. And they fell in love, and they got married. And he wasn't finding a job right away. So my grandfather said, come back to New York and you can work for me. My father wasn't thrilled, but it was a job. So my parents moved to New York, and that was the first time my mother had ever been to the U.S.
Wow. So what year was that?
That was probably 55, perhaps.
And what was your mother doing before that?
She was a serial student.
I know some of those.
She ended up earning 2 doctorates, one in biology and one in natural sciences.
Okay, so your mother's kind of the big headline name, and she's been in the zeitgeist a lot, even recently. How on earth do you go from being a student and a scientist to the grand dame of Italian cooking in America?
Well, she always liked to say that my father could put up with a lot of things, but not a bad meal. So she had never really been interested in cooking before she met my father, but once they got married, she had to start cooking. And she remembered the good things that my grandmother used to make. She had a notebook with notes about the dishes she made. There was a cookbook that my father gave her to use. And I think she discovered the natural instinct for food, for flavors, for how to put them together. And it just came to her easily. And she discovered that this is really what she was good at. So since she liked food, and she liked, other than Italian, she liked Chinese food. So she enrolled in a Chinese cooking course while they were in New York. And the Chinese cooking teacher ended up having to leave to go back to China. And the other students, talking, and, they wanted to know what my mother did and so forth. And in Italy, she had actually been a teacher, a high school teacher, teaching science. And she said, well, I'm a teacher. And I said, but what do you cook? And she said, well, normal food. He said, what's normal food? And so she started telling them the kinds of things that she cooked. And she came home and discovered on the back of her recipes there was a list of 6 names and numbers and addresses. And the title was for Italian cooking classes. And she thought, well, that's a joke. But then they called and asked, so when are the classes starting?
What?
And so she started doing cooking classes.
But then how does it become so big? I mean, I was just reading an article, I think, in the Washington Post about your mother yesterday, and we'll talk about that later. But, there was no social media back then. She's now credited with popularizing Italian food. There are foods I can't even popularize in my own house. Like, I made a Greek salad last night, and I had to leave olives off for half the people. So how does one popularize a whole group of food at that time?
So after this first group, finished their series of classes, my mother thought, well, okay, so this is it. That was fun. But then one day, my mother got a phone call from Craig Claiborne. Craig Claiborne was the food editor at the New York Times then. He said he was very interested in the fact that she was doing these Italian cooking classes. Nobody else was. And he wanted to come and interview her. So she said, fine. He said, when do you want to come? And he said, well, how about 12 o'clock on such a day? And she said, well, my husband comes home for lunch. And he goes, really? Well, that's very interesting. My mother said, well, why don't you come to lunch? And he said, well, I don't usually accept lunch invitations, but this is very unusual and I'd love to come. So a huge feature article ended up getting written in the New York Times. And that's pretty much really what launched her.
Wow. Amazing. So how do you think your cooking and her cooking changed being here in Florida with the ingredients that we have and just the different people that are here?
I don't think the cooking changed because the essence of the cooking remains the same. But of course you're using different ingredients. True, you're not getting, the incredibly flavorful vegetables that you have in Italy. But there's things that are good here too. There's the local seafood. So I think it's just a question of preparing things with the same style and flavor, palette. Let's say, like there's a dish that I teach all the time, which is a salmon that's baked in a pouch with fresh tomatoes and herbs. And I always tell people, if you've been to Italy, you probably think it's kind of strange that I'm making salmon because salmon is not an Italian fish at all. And in Italy, you would never, find this made with salmon. But when I came back to the States to test the recipes for the book that I was writing at the time, I thought that salmon might go well with it. And I tried it and it was perfect. And so, if salmon were an Italian fish, that's how it would want to be prepared. So that's kind of the idea.
Yeah. So it's a little bit of fusion, a little bit of Florida.
Yeah. Using what you have available here, but the flavors are still the same.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. So talk to me about growing up. It sounds like you grew up in New York City. Is that right?
I did, yes. I grew up in New York until I went to college. I always liked to sit in the kitchen and watch my mother cook. I mean, I've always liked good food, but I was always curious about, how she cooked and how she did things. And so I think I kind of learned by osmosis, just by kind of absorbing it as I watched her.
Okay. Did you have siblings?
No, only child.
It's all on you. No pressure. Okay. Paint a picture for me. Where are you in New York? What does that kitchen look like? What are the smells? What were the dishes she was making on repeat?
So, we lived in 2 apartments. The first one, the kitchen was absolutely minuscule. The second one got a little bit bigger, but was mostly long and narrow. But my mother was an expert at maximizing space and using it efficiently. So she actually managed to, have cooking classes in this kitchen. And the kind of dishes that she made were, the dishes that she had been used to in Italy making. So they didn't really change that much. At first, if she wanted to make artichokes, she had to go all the way to 9th Avenue to find the place where they actually had artichokes. Now artichokes are everywhere, but it wasn't the same then. Also, olive oil was hard to find, but she would seek these ingredients out and make Italian food.
It's so wild to think that olive oil was hard to find. She's partly the reason why it's no longer hard to find, would you say?
Definitely. And that's true for a lot of ingredients that now have become commonplace.
Like what?
Balsamic vinegar, for example. She was the one who brought back a little bottle of balsamic vinegar one year, and Chuck Williams came over. He's the founder of Williams & Sonoma. So she showed it to him, and he thought it was great. And a few months later, she ended up seeing it in his catalog.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
But she actually regrets bringing balsamic vinegar because, you go to the supermarket now and you see these shelves with these, half-liter bottles, and balsamic vinegar is something that is incredibly precious. Something that you would start making in the attic for your grandchildren, because it requires long aging, and it's concentrated, it's very intense in flavor, and has absolutely nothing to do with the big, huge bottles you see in supermarkets now.
Watching her cook, you said she was cooking the things she was used to making in Italy. What were some of her greatest hits? And did you eat Italian food for dinner every night?
Yes. I mean, as she had told those students, it was normal food. So she would make pasta dishes or risotti. She liked cooking with veal rolls and seafood, all kinds of things, really.
Okay, so we're talking about like the 1950s, maybe 1960s, and it seems you said that no one else was teaching Italian cooking in New York, which seems kind of insane now. What do you think it was about your mom or about your family that gave her the confidence to really be forward with it? Because there were probably other Italian people there who wanted to water down maybe their Italianness.
Well, I think there was a couple of things going on. One is, Italian-American cuisine is a cuisine that developed when immigrants who didn't have very much of anything when they were in Italy came to the States and began being able to afford more. So they added things that it was very difficult for them to have before, like meat, for example. So that's probably how, the big meatballs on pasta developed, because that's something that doesn't exist in Italy. That's really just Italian-American food. So for one thing, especially at that time, we're talking about the 60s really, and early 70s, Italian-American food was predominantly the Italian food that people knew in the States. They didn't know real Italian food like people had in Italy, and that's what my mother brought. And my mother was always somebody who would not compromise. She wouldn't change things and, to please, people who were expecting something different. She always cooked so that the flavors would be true to what she remembered and what she liked.
What a great lesson. Okay, so you're the only child of this person who's becoming a bigger and bigger food personality. What did you want to be when you grew up? What did you think you would be doing now, or did you always want to go down a similar path?
I thought being a race car driver would be fun. But when I went to college, I'd always been interested in theater, and I decided I wanted to make theater my career. And after college, I actually went to a professional theater school for 2 years. But during this time, my mother opened a cooking school in Italy. She was really one of the first person to open a school for people to come and spend a week taking classes and learning about the ingredients. So I was always helping out with that because it was during the summers. And in fact, towards the end of the period that my mother had her school in Bologna, 9 or 10 years after it started, I even started doing some of the teaching. So I decided to start doing some classes on the side.
Okay, so how did you decide I'm going to really embrace this and make it my own? Because now you teach cooking classes here in your home?
Yes.
Your kitchen is beautiful. You just made me this fabulous cappuccino that I've already drunk all of it. Like, you are your own, you're not just Marcella's son. You are Giuliano. Like, you are your own brand and your own personality. You've got your own cookbooks and your own cooking school. How did you decide, all right, I'm not just going to, teach when I can't find a theater gig. I'm really going to lean into this cooking thing?
I found that I really enjoyed teaching. In a way, it was kind of like a performance. So it was like the way that my theater training was pointing me to, in a sense. And I always enjoyed food, and I like to cook. So I started doing more and more of it. And until I was actually asked to write my first cookbook, which was the classic pasta cookbook. And then it just took off from there.
Now, how do you even approach writing a cookbook when it seems like there's nothing new under the sun? How did you develop these recipes, and how do you sort of move the ball forward while keeping those traditions alive?
The thing is that everybody has their own way, a little bit, of doing things, even though it may not be totally different. My mother has a tomato sauce that's become very, very famous. If you Google tomato sauce Marcella Hazan, it always comes up. And it has just 4 ingredients in it: tomatoes, onions, butter, and salt. And that is it. But my father says that he could tell the difference when my mother made it or when I made it. So even something that has just 4 ingredients can be a little bit different. I mean, there's so many different dishes and recipes in Italy that I don't think you can ever run out. So there were a lot of dishes that I discovered doing research in Italy, and then would, come back home to the States and test.
That must have been fun. And thank you for correcting me. I think I said Marcella, but it's Marcella. You got to get that Italian accent down. So what's next for you? And what do you want your legacy to be?
What's next is doing, more of these courses in Italy that we've been doing. We started 25 years ago in northern Italy, and we do courses outside of Verona, which is sort of halfway in between Milan and Venice. We collaborate with a wine producer in the area. And then recently we started doing courses in Tuscany. She has estates in Tuscany as well. And then the latest thing that we're working on is to see if we can put together a course in Piedmont too, and go and experience white truffles and the wines of Piedmont.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll be there. Well, let's do the next interview there.
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll be there. Okay, just a couple more questions. We mentioned earlier that your mother and your whole family were recently featured in the Washington Post, I think it was?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the impetus for that story was that the Smithsonian has acquired some of your mom's cooking utensils and instruments.
Correct.
What they haven't quite decided yet what to do with them, it sounds like. They just have them for now. But like, what's something that stands out to you? It could be from that collection or just her own kitchen from you growing up. Like, if you had to choose an object that represented her, represented your family, what would that be?
You know, it's interesting because all these tools that we gave them, that they chose, actually, are not very, sophisticated, complicated, highly tech tools, because they're all very, very simple. It's a spatula that has, just kind of the right shape and everything, and works ideally to stir risotto with. And then, of course, pasta making equipment, a rolling pin, a tool to make a kind of homemade pasta called garganelli. Garganelli are shaped kind of like penne, except that they're made with homemade egg pasta. And the tool kind of looks like a comb, like a big comb, and you use like a dowel to roll the pasta on and press it onto the tines of this comb. And so out comes this tubular shape with lines on it. So they have that. What's kind of interesting about that article is that, my mother passed away in 2013, so it's been 11 years now. And the title of the piece was Marcella Hazan's Moment.
You know what? I wrote down, you see on my list of questions, why now? What do you think it is?
Well, I don't know exactly how it happened just now, but it seems like there's like a whole confluence of events. Another thing that's in the works is a movie, a documentary about my mother that's been in the works for years, actually. That is going to be released this fall. And my mother's book called Essentials of Classic Italian Cuisine was reissued in a 30th anniversary edition last year. And another one of her books called Marcella's Italian Kitchen, which was actually her favorite of all her books, is going to be reissued this fall. So it seems like, a lot of things are happening now for her.
Yeah.
She's doing very well for...
She's doing great. But you're doing great too. And I told you before we started recording, someone reached out to me and said, you should try to get Giuliano Hazan on the podcast. And I said, that would be great. And then I emailed you. And before you even had a chance to respond, 2 other people recommended that I speak to you. So you're having a moment as well. And the torch has been passed to you. But I want to know a little bit about your family. I met your beautiful wife. But just tell me about your family and what does dinner time look like for you now here in Sarasota?
Well, we have 2 daughters. They're out of the house now. The younger one is in college, and the older one has been working. She's actually just about to start law school. She's been spending the past 3 months in Milan, in Italy, because she wanted to perfect her Italian. And she seems to be enjoying the life in Italy very much. Doesn't really want to come back, but she will.
Keep telling yourself that.
And you were asking what we make for dinner. Last night, I did a pasta with asparagus and guanciale. I don't know if you are familiar with guanciale. It's cured pork jowl. It's kind of like pancetta, but it's from a different part of the pig. I did a grilled fish with just a simple oregano, lemon juice, and olive oil sauce. Most of the things that we make are pretty straightforward and simple.
A lot of good food all up and down the family tree.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, this has been amazing. I feel like you've just taken me on a tour of like the whole world just in one conversation. This is fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Let people know what you're working on or just anything else?
I think I'm going to continue with what I've got on my plate. And I still enjoy doing cooking classes very much. So we'll continue doing the classes here in Sarasota. And then in the fall, we're going to Italy and doing some courses there again. This is a brochure for
you've got the brochure right here. Oh, this is tempting. Join Giuliano Hazan for spectacular gastronomic adventure in northern Italy. Oh my gosh. And then stop.
The villa where everybody stays.
Oh, and the first thing you see is the fire.
The fireplaces are incredible.
Oh.
And then we do hands-on classes. There's a day that we devote to homemade pasta making.
Oh my gosh. Look at this villa. I mean, you could just...
More wine than you thought was possible.
Wow. Okay, so people just need to go to GiulianoHazan.com to get more information, because this is, do you need someone to carry your bags? Because I'm available.
Okay.
It's a deal, and I'll just bring back some of that good olive oil. Well, Giuliano, this was such a treat. Thank you so much for your hospitality, for all the great...
For coming here, and this was lovely.
Giuliano Hazan is an award-winning cookbook author and culinary teacher. You might want to check out his cooking classes at his house in Sarasota or embark on a trip to his cooking school in Italy. And if you do, please take me with you. I would happily carry your luggage. In any case, you can read more about Giuliano Hazan in the profile I wrote of him for the fall issue of Forum. That's the magazine of Florida Humanities. You'll find a link to the magazine, to Giuliano's website so you can check out those cooking classes, and also to some of his fantastic recipes. They're all on our website, thezestpodcast.com. Now, next week we are continuing our fantasy trip to Italy. We're catching up with Dan Bavaro of Bavaro's Pizza as he celebrates 15 years in the business. I'm Dalia Colon. I produce The Zest with Andrew Lucas and Alexandria Ebron. The Zest is a production of WUSF. Copyright 2024, part of the NPR network.